Well, the point of my speech today that the Anthropocene is the age of waste. And I would like to start with a quote. The quote from the very beginning of the paper by Crutzen, where he sort of introduced the notion of Anthropocene in nature. For the past 3 centuries, the effect of humans on the global environment has escalated. Because of these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, global climate may depart significantly from natural behavior for many millennia to come. It seems appropriate to assign the term Anthropocene to the present, in many ways human-dominated geological epoch, supplementing the Holocene, the warm period of the past 10 to 12,000 millennia. Crutzen in his paper is mentioning several examples of what he means has contributed to the Anthropocene: carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide emissions, nitrogen, fertilizer, chlorofluorocarbons. Paul Crutzen is a chemist. He obtained the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995 for his work on ozone. And of course, he's explaining in this way the Anthropocene in chemical terms. But I'm a social scientist, and instead of explaining the Anthropocene in chemical terms, I would say that what has prompted the transition from the Holocene to the Anthropocene is a kind of institutionalized, intensive wasting. You could say that chemicals are the material cause of the Anthropocene, but the efficient cause, what's the cause which is behind, are the enduring and systematic wasting practices that have let this chemical pollute the earth. And I think this is where the social sciences have a contribution to make to understand the state of the world as it is now. What has brought forth the Anthropocene is the systematic use of fossil fuel for mobility, for heat, for the production of plastics. It's also the systematic release in the environment of persistent chemicals via, for example, industrial processes or in products. It is also the systematic release of artificial nutrients in water streams by the agriculture. Therefore, that if we are to understand how we ended up changing the climate, we need to understand, as Susan Gilles says, waste regimes. Wasting regimes is, according to me, the explanation to the Anthropocene. Because the natural sciences, they will explain how CO2 and methane and other gases add to the greenhouse effect. But it's an incomplete explanation of the Anthropocene, since this explanation misses that if these gases have been emitted in so large quantities, it is because of economic practices, because of social practices, that have made it possible to systematically leave those gases behind at no cost and without any responsibility. So some people prefer to speak of the Capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene, to stress that not all of the humans and all of this economic system have been having the same negative impact on the environment, and that the impact on climate change, on global warming and biodiversity is an outcome of capitalism, a system, and not of humans. This is why they challenge the notion of Anthropocene. But I will not go into this Capitalocene versus Anthropocene discussion today, human versus economic system. And I will actually turn instead to a Swedish comic called Tage Danielsson, who once said that cars should have exhaust pipes on their forehand, not on the backhand, so that will be the one who drives who also dies. I think there is something very strong in Tage Danielsson's point. It's just because humor is also always so powerful, that an essential trait of our contemporary mode of living, that we are moving forward by leaving things behind. And what we leave behind is waste. Waste is CO2 in the air is waste. Nuclear waste in deep geological repository We leave stuff in landfills, microplastic at sea. That's a waste everywhere we keep leaving it. And on this account, that's kind of a parenthesis, but on this account, waste is not only, I would say, a privileged entry point to understand the Anthropocene, it's also a privileged entry point to understand sustainability. If we take a look at the languages in Europe, in languages, sustainable in sustainable development, durable in développement durable in French, Holbar in Hållbarutveckling in Swedish, Nachhaltig in Nachhaltigkeit in German, sustainably in Desarrollo Sostenible in Spanish, all point at duration. And what is better at standing the test of time than waste? Waste is what remains. It is what lasts, and sometimes for an indefinite period of time. Waste archaeologists have been showing that landfills are like the millefeuille of the consumption of the past, layers of discarded legacies, slightly left one over the other one. Nuclear waste will last longer than civilization. And no one will ever be able to retrieve just but a very, very small fragment part of plastic litter from the sea. Nearly all of the plastic at sea will remain forever in the water and on the seabed. The point is that waste never goes away. It waits, and, which is the point of the Anthropocene, it wins. I think this point was made in a very clear and brilliant way by the Italian author Italo Calvino in the short story Leonia in the book Invisible Cities from 1974. Shortly, and just encourage you to read this 2 or 3 pages long short story, but shortly, the city of Leonia is a city, it's a fictional city, which is refashioning itself every day. Every morning, the people in Leonia wake up with new stuff. Everything is new and fresh around them. They use it during the day and they discard everything in the evening, upon which city cleaners come up, pick up everything, and just dispose it just outside the city. What the people of Leonia are unaware of, and that the city is actually at the bottom of a pit because it's completely surrounded by a mountain of waste, which is just waiting to roll down and bury them and to waste. Or maybe the city close to them. And if something will disappear, and that's, I think that's a strong point of Calvino, if something will disappear, it's not the city, it's not the waste, it's the city. Waste will not disappear, the city will. This is where I think the connection between the threat of the Anthropocene and waste is done. And I just think that Calvino's story is just an extremely brilliant understanding on it. So if I connect back this to the famous definition of sustainable development in the Brundtland report, or common future, and just for memory, development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we all know that. But such a definition about sustainable development and sustainability, which is wedged on the notion of need and the notion of satisfaction of need. But this definition misses that the key challenge for future generations might not be the satisfaction of their need, but the way to manage the waste legacies of the past. Manage the waste legacy of CO2, which will be far above the 470 parts per million in March 2021. Manage the legacy of persistent chemicals, which are called forever chemicals. Manage the dysfunctional buildings, which have been cheap to build, but extremely expensive to dispose, if at all. Manage the colossal amount of downcycled materials, which are sort of accumulating, and so on. This is where the challenge of future generation would be. If you backcast the future of waste, I will define sustainable development in a different way. I would say that sustainable development is a present that would allow for future generations to cope with the waste of their ancestors. And I think there are a couple of questions we should be asking. How will future generations be able to live among the waste that will surround them? Is the future of humanity to be living on a dump? This question being asked, the question next is, how have we ended up there? And my answer is that we have been ending up there because of kind of a multi-level normalization of waste-intensive practices. Waste-intensive practices have become sort of normalized in the sense of accepted, no longer questioned, no longer set to a kind of inquiry. And here, I just like to, first of the reason of this normalization of waste would be the notion of negative externalities, which was developed by Sidgwick and Pigou, who died 1900 and 1959, respectively. Negative externalities are defined as, quote, a cost or benefit that is imposed on a third party who did not agree to incur that cost or benefit, end of quote. That's Wikipedia definition. But it's clear, negative externalities are the possibility to shift over to someone outside of a transaction, the cost that no party within the transaction wants to carry. You just pass a burden on a third part. You pass the bill to someone else. You pass the environmental bill. You pass the ecological bill to someone else, as if there will be an outside where to dump the environmental and social cost, which is exactly, again, the Leonia fallacy. Thinking that there is an outside of Leonia, which is neutral when you can just throw things away forever without those things never returning to you, which they will, which they do. In practice, industries have been extremely effective at gaining an acceptance for their negative externalities of the pollution by invoking their role as a creation of jobs, their creation of welfare, their contribution to growth. They have been able to say, well, then we can pollute and we can externalize a large part of a cost that we don't need to carry. And you can buy our products safely because you don't need either to bear the cost. We just externalize the cost. We externalize the cost of waste, of systematic wasting. Which is very also interesting because by externalizing waste, companies and markets have been able to maintain an image of kind of master of efficacy, master of efficiency. The idea that the markets and companies are so efficient is a narrative that only holds if you manage to keep the waste outside. It's again the Leonia fallacy of a world where it is possible to always live with a new and as if once discarded things disappear. And in this role, I think, in this account, and because I'm a management scholar originally, even if I define myself as a social scientist today, I think that economic and management scholarship are very prompt at celebrating this efficiency of markets and efficiency of companies by sort of evacuating, removing, discarding waste. And I think that one of the things that we are doing in opening the bin is sort of reintroducing waste in social life. And by reintroducing waste in social life, we are asking the questions that should have been asked. And it's very political in the sense that we are asking questions about what is going to happen with the city, political in this sense. Because even if you have a definitional elimination of waste from the equation of efficiency, waste is still waiting. In a recent study I've made with a colleague of mine in Lund University, we went to companies which have been in a way singled out in the professional press for their efforts with waste prevention. So we went to them and asked them, okay, what have you been doing for waste prevention? And then, well, they say, well, not much actually. And instead of telling us what they've been doing about waste prevention, they started to tell us why they could not do much. All of them. Maybe one or two exceptions, more than 30. And among the reasons they gave us were 3 reasons. The first thing is that they were telling us that it's more expensive to prevent waste than to waste. The second reason they gave, well, we have no technology to actually prevent waste. And the third reason, and we have no organizational routine or Rather, waste prevention is disturbing our routines. We are so used to work this way, and this is how we are efficient, and this is how we have been learning how to do things. And what we realized, that they were extremely normalizing their wasting practices. When we asked them, what do you do about waste prevention? They say, we don't do much about prevention, but listen, it's very rational. We are extremely rational because it's economically motivated, technologically motivated, organizationally motivated. This is what we mean is a kind of normalization by waste producers of waste. And in this case, we decided to study not the consumers, which have been otherwise so often studied. We're using about the producers of industrial and commercial waste, which is much larger than actually household waste. So externalization of waste, normalization of waste, but this normalization of waste is not a stop at the production and distribution phase. You also have it at the consumption phase. Industry and commerce have been very clever at gaining acceptance for systematic wasting. And we know that since Van Spacker work in the 60s, this systematic replacement of functional stuff, like for example, the phone that I have showing here, it's a perfectly functional phone, simply that an update of the app where I have the ticket for my commute made it dysfunctional. I had to discard it. We have been moving from one phone in whole family with one device lasting for 25 years to at least one phone per person with devices holding less than 2 years. How come? I think this is a kind of question we need to ask. And I think this is a kind of question that Opening the Bin Network is asking, and that's good questions. There is a kind of a red thread from the celluloid collars that waste archaeologists have been finding at the bottom of landfills, because this is the first thing they found. Those kind of collars that men were sort of adding so that you don't need to wash the old shirt, you just have the fresh collar. To, for example, the replacement of multiple-use bottles by single-use bottles described, by example, in the book by Guy Hawkins about plastic water, or today's frantic pace of replacement of clothes, of electronic, of furnitures, of sport equipment, of tourist destination, wellness practices, and other objects of fashion. I really want also to emphasize that this idea of replacement is not only for the kind of things that we'd be thinking of immediately, such as, for example, a telephone. It's also a question about replacement of destinations, because all those practices will sort of generate high level of consumption and high level of wasting. Under conventions of comfort, cleanliness, and convenience, and here I'm referring to Shove, comfort, cleanliness, and convenience have been sort of driving a kind of hyperconsumption, an acceleration of hyperconsumption, which has been accustoming customers to more and more intensive wasting. Coming to the point where people don't even see the problem with throwing away this kind of phone, which is actually a sophisticated device, which is perfectly functional. And my point is that when newness is the product, then is waste not very far. The key thing is that waste pays. It's profitable. And in a capitalist economy, what is profitable gets growing. Waste is not an accidental failure, it's an intentional success. Many industries thrive on producing and selling soon to become waste. Waste intensivity creates jobs, it enriches stockholders, and it fuels growth. Communities, local communities compete to attract activities of production and distribution, regardless of how much waste they produce. Neighboring municipalities will be fighting for developing shopping centers and attracting new economic activities regardless of waste. The linear economy as a whole is a typical demonstration of the coincidence of high level of profit and high level of wasting. profit and waste, not waste against profit. There is so much money to make at producing soon to be waste that we can really wonder how this is able to stop. The picture I'm showing you is a kind of, it's a printout. It's a screen print, sorry, from a computer program which is used to minimize tactile spill. So the idea that you will be minimizing the white areas between the parts that you will be cutting. Is this waste minimization? Yes, of course, it's waste minimization, but it's waste minimization at the production stage, because it's a waste minimization which is used to cut cost, to be able to cut prices in the apparel industry, with the result that you are cutting costs at such a low level that, as a colleague of mine have been studying, a t-shirt become a single-use item. The Friday t-shirt, which you either discard or put on a selling point on Saturday, the single-use t-shirt. Be efficient, cut prices, sell more, and produce more waste. The fast fashion industry is exemplary of the self-sustaining dynamics of the waste intensity of contemporary economies. There is a red thread that goes from negative externalities in production and distribution to the normalization of short-lived products. Kind of intensive wasting is at the core of business model, and therefore it's a key driving force of economic development. There are many and there are strong incentives to waste. And if I would be to sort of parody the quote, "Greed is good" by Gordon Gekko in the first Wall Street film, and of course, maybe people will not say it because there is always a stigma on waste. I think that for many people would be ready to say waste is good. Not the least representatives of the waste management industry, because this is where they make their living. This is why I really think that just like environmental and social degradation have been engine of economic growth, and here I'm thinking of a paper by Bartolini and Bonatti, waste production has been instrumental in bringing on the Anthropocene. And I will finish this speech with this picture. This is a picture taken at Mariana Trench by the Japanese Maritime Authority. That's a bit of plastic. The thing that we are 10,899 meters below the surface. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rafik, and thank you, Herve, for an amazing keynote. I really like the quote from the Swedish comic on that we need to, I don't know, have the exhaust on the front end. And I'm wondering, I was reminded of a quote from a very, I don't know, lovely essay on waste by Brian Thiel, who argues that waste always returns, but just not to us specifically. So I think that ties into that nicely. And I was wondering, so what are we to do to make sure that we're actually, I don't know, engaged with the exhaust? Because of course it now seems that our waste flows to others, what's been called the global south. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yes, the whole problem is how you define us, where you draw the us. Because that's true, and this is why actually I mentioned the notion of Capitalocene, where, because I think that the critique addressed to the Anthropocene by the Capitalocene is that the wasting and the negative impact of waste is not affecting everybody to the same extent. We see this very clearly, for example, when it comes to climate change. We see this also very clearly when it comes for location of the waste treatment installations. We see this very clearly with the possibility of some countries to afford, I would say, hygienic treatment and collection and treatment of waste, whether this is completely out of prices in many countries in the world, where people are sort of forced to live directly in contact with their garbage. So yes, it's returning, and it's not returning necessarily to the one who produces it. On this account, the Leonia short story by Calvino is a little bit delusive. unless you consider that Leonia is the whole world community on Earth. Otherwise, there is a very strong need to socialize, to economize, and I think even gendered, and actually the gendering of waste is something which I think should be developed. So absolutely, and when I see, for example, images of sewage, open sky sewage, for example, in the global south, which are filled with permanent waste, plastics and other things, it's very different from my concern about some littering in the well-off area in Southern, in Western Malmö, where I live. Absolutely. The us, there are different uses. I don't know if you can say this in English, but
thank you. I'm trying to keep time. Dario, you also have raised your hand, and Anna, can you have short questions or comments?
And short answer, yes, sorry.
Yes, very shortly. I can understand why Capitalocene is not so convincing in your speech, but you were talking about a linear mode of production and consumption and profit and, you know, and things that are about Capitalocene. So is a matter of ontological issues, or it's definitely not working the image of Capitalocene in your perspective?
I think for me the big difference is whether you put the stress. Anthropocene is putting the stress on humans, so whether Capitalocene is putting the stress on economic system, and also the fact that you will have all the socialist economies between 1917 and 1989 have been on exactly the same waste intensivity trajectory, and I think that even alternative views will be. So what I just wanted to avoid, I wanted to show that it's more a question about global human-centered practices, this idea of putting human at the center of the planet and having this idea about the satisfaction of needs, which is still at the core of the Brundtland definition of sustainability, which I think is better addressed by the notion of Anthropocene. But of course, with the need to relativize and socialize the us, which is, I think, where the Capitalocene has a point.
Sorry, wonderful presentation, Herve. I was curious about the study in Lund, and did you report back to the companies about what they were doing, the normalization of waste, and what did you sense that there was any opening for them to actually reflect on this or change their practices? Thanks.
No, but we will do that since you suggested. Good idea.
Thank you very much.